Populist Demagogy in Southeast Asia. Thaksin and Duterte compared. So, why do we have a rise within the last 20 years, certainly, of demagogic populist leaders within Southeast Asia? What are the broader socioeconomic and political factors that have led to the rise of these demagogic figures who whip up popular support for themselves and platforms that are ostensibly more equal in terms of the distribution of wealth and resources, at least ostensibly so? Within the last 30 years or so, there has been a substantial degree of high economic development within Southeast Asia, but this development has not been evenly distributed, and we can see this uneven distribution of wealth manifest itself most potently in places like the Philippines and to a lesser extent in Thailand. So essentially it's this very well-known conundrum in the Western world, also applying to Southeast Asia, more and more wealth being concentrated in fewer and fewer hands, this leading to discontent, and certain political figures taking advantage of that. Thaksin's rise in Thailand was very long in coming, a series of political and socioeconomic developments that were initiated as early as the 1960s and with a massive acceleration in the 1980s, allowed Thaksin Shinawatra to assume the premiership in 2001, and during his time in power from 2001 to 2006, deliver substantially on his populist vision with some major reservations and shortcomings. Beginning in the 1960s, during the height of the Second Indochina War, the United States invested massively in Thailand's infrastructure, its telecommunications technology, and the ability of the Thai state to reach deeper into its own domains. There were a number of entrepreneurs that took advantage of this, particularly in the road construction business. The United States had to ship a number of military weapons, supplies, ammunition, so on and so forth, from the ports of Thailand deep into the interior. And those who got in on this road building racket, as it were, made a killing profit-wise. Beginning in the 1980s, of course, economic development, by about 1985-86, Thailand experienced a substantial economic takeoff, and wealth does, I think, begin to trickle down substantially by that point, away from this Bangkok Thonburi urban metropolis and towards historically deprived regions like the north and the northeast. And Thailand does very well for about a decade or so, from about 85-86, all the way until the Asian crisis of 1997. In 1997, it was thought among a number of figures that global capital, led by the United States and other multinational corporations, was going to use the economic crisis of 1997 as an opportunity to impose itself on Thai national economic life, buying up bankrupt companies at bargain basement prices and so on. And this generated a substantial amount of anti-globalist backlash. Now, Thaksin himself took perfect advantage of this. As a figure, he himself is both conventional and unusual. He is, of course, of Sino-Thai descent, as most Thai business tycoons are. His family came from the Chiang Mai region, which is in the far north of Thailand. He was born into an affluent family and joined the Royal Thai Police in 1973. And while he was still a policeman, he began a number of business ventures, not always very successfully. He owned, a silk business, kind of the beginnings of his interests in rentals and so on and so forth. None of this did him too well, but at the same time, as a very cosmopolitan figure, he associates himself with global forces. He earns a MA in criminal justice from Eastern Kentucky University in the 1970s, and then a PhD also in criminal justice in 1978 from Sam Houston State University in Texas. So he's a very global figure, building up a business enterprise globally and also from the center in Bangkok. He becomes a figure of substance by the 1990s, and he serves briefly as foreign minister from 1994 to 1995, and then is actually deputy prime minister from 1995 to 1997 under Banhan and Chawalit governments, which followed in quick succession. So from 95 to 97, he is prime minister. Then, of course, the Asian economic crisis hits in 1997, and it's, of course, no coincidence that he founds the Thai Rak Thai party in 1998. Thai Rak Thai meaning Thais love Thais, or Thai people love Thai people. It's a kind of populist, demagogic party that espouses a more equal distribution of wealth. In 2001, Thaksin manages to assume power. Thai Rak Thai becomes a very formidable political machine. He is able to incorporate a number of former student radicals from the 1970s. These were intellectual elites at that time, and subsequently they became some of the leading lights of Thai intellectual, economic, and political life. With these people, he is able to combine these elite intellectuals with a populist message that forms a base of support among the North and the Northeast, which are primarily, the Northeast certainly, but also the North, Lao, culturally and also linguistically. Most people speak Lao in these areas of Thailand today. And these areas of Thailand were historically deprived, oppressed, neglected by Bangkok Thonburi concerns and interests. So he begins by essentially working from the center to the periphery. He uses his central influence, his central positions, to incorporate the periphery into his own personal political machine. This is astoundingly successful. He extends, healthcare services and redistributes investment priorities away from the center towards the North and the Northeast. And these regions remain fiercely loyal to him. However, there are problems with the Thaksin administration. He is much less successful in the South and the far Muslim Malay South. At that time, he was attempting to dismantle patronage networks that were royalist, in other words, beyond his control, and put in his own people into this very distant periphery. And this triggered a rebellion, which he did not handle well in the Muslim Malay South, using very harsh police and military repression, which proved counterproductive. It only bred more resistance. In the case of Thailand more generally, he also launches a very violent drug war in 2003, which leads to about 2,500 or so extrajudicial killings, ostensibly attributed to rival drug gangs killing each other off. But these, I think it's fairly well understood, were police death squads or hired guns working for the police, wiping out social undesirables that certain elements within Thai society found disagreeable. These are products of unequal economic development and neoliberal economic policies. These tend to lead to things like drug addiction and socioeconomic inequality. It was not dealt with in a very humane manner. It was a kind of demagogic, populistic response, a law and order platform that would keep capital and investment secure in Thailand. It doesn't work, but because he himself had such a deep and profound network and background in the Royal Thai Police, he's able to hedge it back very quickly. He sees that it could potentially get out of control, and in 2003 he launches it. A couple of months later, he basically stops it because he saw it was going in all kinds of undesirable directions. He had made his point already. He had shown the people that he was in charge. He was a strong man who could crack down on crime and so forth. But to have it linger on endlessly was a very dangerous proposition. Hence, he could hedge it back when it looked like it was going in the wrong direction. Unlike, I think, Rodrigo Duterte, as I will get to in a little bit. So, these events were, I think, failures of Thaksin, the drug war, and the Muslim Malay South insurgency. But the reason I think they received much more press than they probably otherwise would have was because of fears among the royalist establishment oligarchy that Thaksin was attempting to replace them and dispossess them of their rents, of their positions, of their power, and ultimately, of course, of their wealth. So Thaksin's populism posed a profound challenge to the Thai establishment, but it could not displace established power groups within the royalist network monarchy, and they eventually strike back in 2006. They launch a royalist military coup, which, unlike most Thai coups, the coup in 1976 being an important exception, the 2006 coup was a very ideological coup. It was not one, there were elements of that certainly in 2006 as well, but it was not just one group of generals overthrowing another or a group of generals overthrowing a civilian political clique they didn't like. It was a kind of self-defense of the royalist oligarchy against a burgeoning Thaksin oligarchy that was being supported by demagogic populist policies. In the Philippines, a rather different character. If you listen to the rhetoric of Rodrigo Duterte, a certain number of his mannerisms, there are a few very marginal similarities to Thaksin, certainly, but even on the rhetorical level, there are a substantial amount of differences. His behavior as president of the Philippines is rather different, and his policies, I think, are more problematic and might prove, one certainly doesn't want to speculate too much, but might prove to be less successful, or, if we like, less of a danger to the Philippine political elite than the Thaksin phenomenon was. Why is this so? Well, to put it very simply, Duterte is a peripheral elite. So unlike Thaksin, who builds up a base or builds up a group around him from the center, by and large, mainly from the center, and expands out and pulls the periphery in to Bangkok politics. Duterte is very much on the margins of the Philippine archipelago, the Philippine state. He makes a sudden leap, if you like, from the periphery to the center, from Davao City, where he is mayor for several decades, pretty much on and off, from about 1988, and before that he was a kind of special officer in charge during the transition from Marcos to Aquino. Basically, from about 1988, with a few blips in between, in which he puts, his daughter in the mayoral seat. From 1988 to 2016, he basically runs Davao City as his own private fiefdom. At that time, in the late 1980s, Davao City was probably the most unstable urban part of the Philippines. The NPA, the New People's Army, the Communist Army, had established a very deep presence in the city, particularly in slum areas like Agdao. And they were launching a series of assassinations of officials, of army, military, police personnel, and the AFP, the Philippine Military Armed Forces of the Philippines, was retaliating in kind, creating a general sense of urban anarchy and violence. Duterte steps into this anarchy and violence and negotiates with the NPA. He has a very interesting and colored past with the NPA, which I don't want to get into here. Allowing the NPA to essentially withdraw to the fringes, or beyond the fringes, if you like, of Davao City. And he becomes essentially the sole strong man in Davao City. He uses a huge amount of violence. The Davao City Death Squad is well known among human rights activists and so forth. But at the same time, the violence that comes to Davao City, certainly by, I would say, the end of the 80s, the beginning of the 90s, by about 90, 91, 92-ish, it's centered on one man, Duterte. He makes the Davao City Police his own private army. You could see him as a kind of urban warlord, as most peripheral mayors of the Philippines are. However, in Davao City, there is a very particular trajectory and history we need to keep in mind. Because Davao City was a settler frontier zone, you generally find that subaltern settlers, ordinary settlers if you like, rally around and have a much deeper attachment to their political bosses than is generally the case in other parts of the archipelago, because this is as it's seen in their minds, a wild frontier. There are a number of untamed tribes, and law and order are a scarce commodity. Therefore, people who settle in places like Davao, later Davao, what becomes the urban agglomeration and peri-urban hinterland of Davao City, have a much deeper connection to bosses or strongmen or warlords, as I would characterize Duterte, than is the case in certain other parts of the Philippines. At the same time, Duterte's power does not expand outward. It expands inward. He consolidates his power continuously within Davao City. Davao itself used to be a very large region of the island of Mindanao, essentially the whole southeastern chunk of what is today Mindanao. It was gradually parceled out and divided and broken up into smaller pieces during the Marcos era as a way to reward his cronies with political patronage posts. And Duterte, whose father was a Marcos crony, but was wise enough, I think, in the 1960s, 70s, and throughout most of the 80s, not to interfere too much within the Davao region, because Marcos had already allocated that region to Alejandro Almendras initially, and then following Alejandro Almendras to another crony that ran the fruit business in these areas, right? And his father, of course, was governor of the United Davao Davao region. What happens is that he deepens his power, and then he uses that power as a springboard into Manila politics. He's briefly a congressman representing Davao City from 1998 to 2001, and he uses that stint in Manila to make alliances with Joseph Estrada, president at that time, and then with Gloria Macapagal Arroyo. During the Arroyo years, from 2001 to 2010, he is basically the enforcer of Gloria Arroyo's electoral machine, using the Davao City Death Squad to intimidate state opponents, so on and so forth. So he leaps from Davao into Manila politics because he is an unknown. People don't know who he is in the National Capital Region, while people in Mindanao want a Mindanaoan to be president. This allows him to capture certainly wide swaths, most indeed, of the Mindanao vote. This combination of him being an unknown in the National Capital Region and a well-known quantity throughout Mindanao propels him into the presidency. However, in spite of his popularity, there have been difficulties. Number one, he is not, as far as I can see, doing anything of substance to dismantle the established old oligarchic elite. A majority of them are doing business with him. Some of them don't really like him. A couple of them have been jailed as a warning that all the other oligarchs have to fall into line or potentially face the same danger. But it is not having a substantive effect on oligarchic politics within the Philippines. At the same time, the military is not agreeing with his efforts to disassociate the Philippines from the United States and unite with the Chinese, or tilt towards China. The AFP doesn't want that. A number of very senior defense establishment figures, it's quite clear to me at least, one can debate this, but it's quite clear to me that Delfin Lorenzana, the Secretary of National Defense, is not on board with the tilt towards China. He is more or less committed to the U.S. alliance, and Duterte is having a very difficult time unraveling that. At the same time, it seems, you could call this a stroke of bad luck, the COVID pandemic is hitting the Philippines rather hard, and the public health system in place, although there have been expansions of public health provisions, the PhilHealth program and so forth, is having a very difficult time coping with this pandemic. So one wonders whether Duterte will be able to deliver as much as Thaksin did, partly because of maybe bad luck, partly because of the fact that he has a military that has a very special and distinct relationship with the United States that is very difficult to unravel. And at the same time, I think he's diverted and directed most of his energies to a drug war that has proven to be very unwieldy. Duterte had very good control over Davao City, but once he became president of the entire archipelago, he could not handle the Philippine National Police as well as Thaksin handled the Royal Thai Police. And we've seen all kinds of kidnappings and indeed killings, people being held for ransom, wealthy foreign investors being kidnapped, being held for ransom, and sometimes indeed killed, leading to a widespread international backlash. So Duterte has had to call off the drug war and then reinitiate the drug war, sometimes in different forms, sometimes in old forms. There is a zigzagging of this policy, and I don't think, personally, again, one can debate this, personally, the drug war, which has led to probably tens of thousands of extrajudicial killings, will lead to any substantive transformation or elimination of drug use in the slums and cities and indeed smaller towns of the Philippines. It's a way to whip up control. It's a way to whip up support, show decisive, direct, brutish action, rather like Thaksin, but it unleashed a chain of forces that are far harder for the president to control and rein in, and it's really not all that clear to me how all of this is going to play out yet. So Duterte has, I think, more difficulty and might ultimately not be as successful as Thaksin in delivering on his platforms and his programs. The importance of this subject for contemporary Southeast Asia watchers is very much a current one. Demagogy is not only a Southeast Asian phenomenon. We've seen manifestations of it in Western Europe, the United States, Brazil, indeed. It seems to be an era of strong men and demagogues. And all of this is very important to consider when we are studying the region and comparing it with other global areas. However, like other parts of the globe, these demagogues and strongmen have encountered established interests that have mounted a defense of their own privileges, of their own relationships, of their own way of doing business, that these demagogues are having a very difficult time dismantling. And the strength and power of the establishment needs to be given as much importance in the age of demagogy as the demagogues themselves.